Hello everyone, today we talk about the low medieval sergeants between the 11th and the 13th centuries. So we're looking at a tricky, just apparently, category of troops. Sergeants in Latin, servientes, in French, sergent or sergent, came in many different guises. Right? The problem, even of this video, is fundamentally to categorize the sergeant. Who was he? I think it's easier to answer the question by saying who wasn't he, right? And definitely those who they weren't, and even this can be tricky, is the elite knights, right? As such, as we will see, differences between knights and sergeants will fundamentally tend to level at a point. More of that later. But in practice, if we really make to draw an ideal line, boundary between knights proper, and it was the knightly status that, at least in paper, made the difference, then on the battlefield things were different in turn, but relatively still is, in fact, the broader distinction of the idea that the ultra-heavy, hyper-specialized trooper, that it was overloaded also in armor, right? It was all a technicality developing around warfare, which is also in a way the key to understand more properly, as we'll see now, who the sergeants were not the sergeants, right? And for the rest, there is actually a great similarity, and we'll see better, especially in interest of time, how this changed. So, in the feudal terminology, the sergeants were vassals of less than knightly status. They usually held a fraction, usually half, but not always, it was very varied, of a knight's fief, in return for services rendered. So we can't say chiefly military, but sometimes agricultural or domestic, or maybe a combination of these three, or some of them. This is largely normal. I mean, we already made videos on the ministeriales, for example. We have seen even in there they're fundamentally servile, properly, and in this sense also civilian origin, in a way. There are two distinguished things. I mean, the ministeriales as those who had literally to take care of certain properties more than necessarily eventually serving as a military class as they would become, especially in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, retaining servitude as in fact a major feature of German knighthood at the time, because they also took over numerically the rest of the noble knights, let's say the free knights at least. So we're talking of people that fundamentally served, as we've seen, as vassals, and in a condition that is not better determined, right? Because probably a knight's own non-knightly retainers that were technically not vassals to him, but just part of this to these retinues, bore in the sources that here are a bit, blurred, because they're not categorical, scientific, specific in the terms they use, the title of sergeant, right? Albeit there are also other terms such as clientes, so clients, and satellites, so those who fundamentally gravitated around the guy here, the knight, where he was, that in fact also occur in this capacity. This is pretty obvious. In fact, I think an important distinction here we could, or at least a parallelism we can trace, is the one with squires. I mean, the squire is a figure that fundamentally changes also in the history of medieval warfare. Initially, it could be literally just a simple servant, not even with a military nature. Let's say he would accompany his master on the battlefield, and he would gradually be equipped even to fight. But he was at least intended as somebody who supported in literally as a field aid, rather than properly a fighter, like as we will see the sergeants technically were. But squires also change, evolve in that regard. And yes, there is a kind of a middle ground between sergeants and squires that can overlap even at one point. Because here the terms do not distinguish what these guys were up to practically. A squire was crucial for a medieval knight, just like a watcher in a tank crew, right? Especially when armor became ever more enclosing, elements came to be open to this very narrow islets in the front. These guys shouting at the back of their masters, like look left, look right, because watch out where the enemy is coming from, were very important, right? Sergeants are something different. Sergeants come to grow as knights, de facto, right? As milites, as you would more technically define. That is properly a tactical equivalent of a knight, albeit slightly lighter in gear and equipment, but still properly a fighter, as bellator as proper. The chroniclers, however, use the term sergeant even less discriminately sometimes for all non-knightly soldiers, without even differentiating between those of feudal and non-feudal origin, or even between infantry and cavalry. So, speaking of sergeants, it is true that also knights, especially in these first centuries, would fight more frequently on foot than what the late medieval specialized, we could say, heavy cavalry now kind of obliged them to do, because armies were more structured and functionalized in that sense, right? But here, the terminology goes beyond, because there is specifically pedites, as even commoners, as infantrymen, serving as sergeants, technically. And we're talking sometimes of, these sergeants would tend, as we will see, to become ever more professional fighters, because that's what they were meant to be in the end. They weren't just specifically auxiliary forces, but they were sometimes mercenaries, right? I don't know, the Flemish infantry during the 12th, 13th century, especially actually the one from Brabant, was prized for its, let's say, sergeants, as these guys that served both actually on they had, as all armies at the time, cavalry and infantry, but they were also more famous for their infantry, given the exception still in those centuries for the effectiveness of that arm. But fundamentally, they are considered as sergeants because they are serving in a way that sometimes was not, in fact, just mercenaries. Sometimes there were specific town militias would be mobilized like that, right? But at least they were conceived properly as a troop, and not as field aids that medieval armies had, naturally, as all armies, in large and abundant quantity, and still capable of taking arms or making mass, right? This was somewhat normal. So, as you understand here, the range can vary from literally a disarmed squire to a knight, to a normal knight that fights as such and doesn't actually differ in terms of individual and collective training from the properly the knightly status one. So today we could expand the topic even on this enlarged definition of sergeant, including infantries and so on, but we will do that on another occasion, because we still have to make a bit about infantry here and there. We will make lots of them, the various typologies of medieval Europe. Today we speak of sergeants mostly as the non-noble vassals and retainers that by the 12th century usually fought, right, or at least were meant to fight in the best situations as horsemen. I stress that up to still at this point, the 12th century is really the crucial step in the evolution, we could say, of of medieval knighthood in the more stereotypical, thickly packed, crusade, lance, charge-oriented shock tactics formation, right? In up to the century before, and even in the 12th century, for example, in areas like Germany, knights were often dismounted, right? Were obliged by the contingencies or simply preferentially according to the tactical advantage they thought they could derive from. So definitely we can't speak of only cavalry troops, but the 12th century is also the century, in fact, in which the professionalization of warfare and development of feudal political and institutional structures brings these fighters to be ever more detached from, let's say, the average guy out there that up maybe to the previous century still could pick a spear and shield in his hands and make a difference on the battlefield. And while now there is all a technicality of warfare, equestrian warfare, that renders, and this is even just on the market of war, the capacity of challenging these elite fighters ever more difficult for the other strata of the population, especially in the most feudalized areas where the peasantry was disarmed earlier, right? Maybe in towns, city-states, militias still had that capacity of countering even cavalry at this point, notably in certain situations. But let's say that this is the century of cavalry on the fastest rise, in a sense, and therefore literally the equestrian practice here dominates, right? And the idea that there is a guy, a lord with a retinue that goes around back and forth across the country and making a mess is just by default mostly a matter of a cavalry corps that is segmented also on the base of these different extraction of the troops that actually becomes at this point more open at certain levels, let's say, at least, especially for these retinues, right? Because in the 11th century maybe it was easier to become properly a knight. There wasn't much of a great difference at the end of the day. These guys lived as brigands fundamentally on a regular basis, considering that the majority of them. By the 12th century there is an elite instead that is, as we've seen, detaching from the rest, but that is also including in its own clientele, military clientele, people coming from different backgrounds, and that are in fact to form these sergeant, let's say, class is a big word, but it gives you the idea of what the practical divide could be. They were not the knightly status guys. There were other people who came to fight basically in the same way they did, but they were still distinguished a little bit from them. So, in fact, the sergeant's equipment is most often described as similar, but somewhat lighter than that of knights. They were evidently poorer, right? They were meant in a way or another, independently of how they were levied, hired, whatever, equipped with less than the elite knight would be. In the late 11th, early 12th century, especially, the sergeant equipment might have been lighter than is usually thought, and this is probably the moment in which also the difference with squires was looser, right? And where we can even draw we can even overlap the figures in some way, not stressing too much the equation, but still considering from the sake of combat and equipment point of view what these functions could be, right? Because first of all, these are still primitive times, right? Even having an armored knight available costed an enormous amount of money. So it was normal for, let's say, all the non-heavily armored to be kind of light, right? And therefore, with the protection that a squire or a sergeant could afford, maybe weren't so different in practice. And always given that, in fact, the wide majority of combatants at this time was lightly armored, right? Mostly with padded armor, things like that. Right, metal was still kind of relatively rare, surely enormously expensive to find in substantial proportion in an army. And there is a document that is the inquest of Bayeux, dating to 1133, that records that that man holding less than a knight's fief. So we're talking about the Angevin-dominated Normandy here, were to serve mounted and armed with lance, shield, and sword, but armor is not mentioned at all. So we understand that, of course, there was a mounted service, as there had always been in previous centuries, of more lightly equipped cavalry compared to the heavier one. Whether these guys were properly called sergeants, we don't know, honestly. We also have iconographic evidence showing knights accompanied by men with only lance, shield, sword, and helmet that we can identify with sergeants. Now, this is interesting because we don't have to underestimate the tactical effectiveness of this cavalry. I mean, even the fact that they were equipped with a sword is very meaningful, right? These were not kind of militias or anything. I mean, in order to know how to use a sword, profitably know how to ride a horse in combat, armed like that, is a big deal, right? And as we were saying before, it would be, say, normal, even for a knight, technically, to be equipped like that sometimes. We have seen it often, for example, in the Crusader states. Some make legitimately the point, even certain extreme temperatures under, I don't know, the Syrian sun, etc., in summer, would make knights abandon armor. This happened often, also in Europe. So even this detail is not per se, a categorical discriminant between those who fought like knights and those who didn't, right? Because sometimes you would actually even charge with that kind of equipment. It is different. It does make a difference. We'll see it better later with the Templar rule. But at the same time, it's still, a medium cavalry. Like, you don't kid around with this. They can carry out a cavalry charge with a lance, right? They have probably also a high, collective training, right? And it's a big deal to be equipped like that in the first place. Naturally, lighter cavalry is also the most numerous and the most dynamic on the battlefield. These are the guys that harass still as early as this, even with javelins, as we know. Softening up the enemy ranks before the charge of the heavier guys, for example, ideally. Then, outflanking the enemy, pursuing it, and running, right? Because the heavier guys have, more difficulty relatively, because still, as we were saying before, the heavier type of, even at this point, horses were still relatively small. Just now there is the transition towards the heaviest guys and the rest, right? Before, it's like differences are relative. So, typical horseman like this would have a tunic, a hose, not even necessarily a patterned armor. Yes, it can be, because at the end of the day, even if that was probably the most convenient form of armor by a certain standard, there are still some limitations with it, and in certain circumstances you may want to have also that kind of basically zero protection times. These unarmored figures proper, however, disappear from the sources by the mid-12th century. This is very important because towards this time we see the acceleration in that trend of professionalization of of troops, of development of heavier cavalry. So things on the battlefield were becoming definitely harder, and this kind of unarmored troops weren't so useful anymore. After this, we see only armored horsemen appearing. So much that it's even difficult to distinguish them from one another. Naturally, iconographic sources can have an artistic license, but the idea we get is that sergeants and knights now didn't properly differ that much. There are interesting figures that I've inserted even in here somewhere. There's an Englishman from the Winchester Bible of around the mid-12th century, a Frenchman from the illustration of the Battle of Bouvines in Matthew Paris, mid-13th century Historia Maiora, that are equipped with some incomplete or old-fashioned, we could say, armor, and it's thought that they represent sergeants. Right. Consider also this aspect, which is somewhat overlooked. I mean, how was armor recycled, especially by those who couldn't afford more than much? I mean, at that point, technology didn't improve very quickly. There are important changes that tell us a big deal about how combat was evolving, but at the same time, if you really need a body armor of sword, you can use also older stuff, given that naturally this was worn out, it had to be kept in a way, but sometimes it was literally better than nothing. And also archaeologically, we unfortunately have a few even of other solutions, but we wouldn't be surprised to use to see, for example, padded armor normally doesn't arrive to us because it perishes. But even you could say wood or horn, things like these, that probably were. They found their way. It had been like that also in the past. This is not the point, though. The point is that there is, from these iconographic evidence, the realization that some troops would be equipped in this kind of B series, second category equipment, which makes sense considering in part the extraction of these people and how they were hired properly to fight. The short mail corselets that are shown in both of the aforementioned pictures are usually described as aubergine, so the diminutive of hauberk properly. So this was actually, we know, the regulation form of body armor of sergeants in the Order of the Temple, that in the 12th century issued a rule that states, by the way, that such corselet sleeves were to be without mittens and the chausses without foot pieces. Also, the same sergeants had to substitute an iron cap for a helmet. This is interesting because there is a specificity in this equipment. It doesn't say, you have to be fundamentally lightly armored to court, like not wearing, for example, iron armor, which already was a big deal. I mean, by the 12th century here, still, those were considered heavy cavalry, even when equipped like that, right? So the detail is fascinating because it says fundamentally you have to be uncovered in your hands, in your feet, and in your head partially, right? An iron cap there is fundamentally leaving open more the face, the sides. Here at this point, eventually facial armor would evolve, right, or would fundamentally appear as the most first like with a plague, like eventually by the 13th century enclosing all the face. So this cap is, like, I presume also the ancestor, the chapelle de fer, meant as mostly, protecting the upper part of the skull. And of course, sometimes it was worn under, an hauberk would cover the head as well. So there were different solutions here. But altogether, we basically see that the body armor remains more or less the same. These guys had to be more freer with their hands, without mittens. That at this point, by the way, still didn't have the it was just like the various fingers weren't covered separately. It was just a big, fingerless hand, just with the thumb actually moving. Also with the foot, right? Which is important because foot armor was developing as specifically for cavalry, as infantries were starting to become also more dangerous, and therefore the foot would be more exposed, and simply on horseback you are simply an easier target in general. The same goes for the helmet, that would cover the face gradually because knights would charge at each other frontally, normally in the thickly packed formation, and pointing with their lances at each other's faces. So this distinction, albeit not radical, from the status between knights and sergeants, speaks of fighters that, in my opinion, were a bit more dynamic on the field, in this kind of lighter type that, however, could serve more flexibly either on horseback, on foot, maybe handling a crossbow, right, or a bow, or having to jump here and there to disarm an enemy on the ground. While the elite knight was heading ever more towards the specialization as the charger, right? And these other guys were also gaining in weight something, because even if you take away that piece of armor, it's not immense, but it's still extra weight. So this is not to be overlooked about even the eventual diversification of the type of combat between these what had been, independently of their status, fundamentally horsemen since the previous centuries, without these dramatic differences, right? Also, the same rule of the Order of Temple states that less well-armored troopers, the sergeants specifically, less armored than knights, let's stress it, were not expected to stick it out for as long on the battlefield, right? So much that, quote, they will have the gratitude of God and the order if they fight well, but if they see they cannot endure or are wounded, they may withdraw without asking permission and without punishment. This applied, however, only to those sergeants with little or no armor sometimes, so those who were equipped as knights were expected to fight as knights. So here you see that even the sergeants were segmented in a sense. And of course, if you have a full knightly panoply, that's what you're expected to serve for in a world where, producing this stuff was an enormous cost. The surplus was ridiculous, and therefore you had to employ all the resources in the best way. But this last phrase we quoted about the fact that these guys would fight, but if they were wounded they could retreat, actually enforces, in my opinion, the fact that they had a slightly different role already on the field. Because if you count on a heavily armored guy to fight out there in the fray, you don't simply tell him, if you're wounded you can't simply retreat, and implying, by the way, with this phrase, that the other guys didn't have to, right? Because the Order of the Temple considered the Templars and other monastic military orders were fundamentally conceived to create something that was not at all actually different in technical terms from any other knight, but that, mentally speaking, were meant basically to fight to the death, taking away tens of enemies in the meanwhile, so to stand their ground to death. So the fact that these guys were said, that you'll have the gratitude of God anyway and of the order, so it's fine, but you can't fundamentally retreat without asking permission, by the way. And consider that these statues had an iron-like discipline. So this tells you they weren't properly deployed and employed in combat as the heavier knights, right? And now that I was thinking about that before, the fact that they wouldn't have the mittens, the fit armor and so on, and also a more open helmet, actually tells us another important side of the story, because the head, just for the most vital part of the body, and also the hands and feet, as you know, those we had to considerably employ also in melee at close combat, are if they are unarmored, well, the idea is that probably you will tend not to be so eager to close in, right? So probably your role in combat is already a bit more detached in different ways. Of course, they would fight in hand-to-hand combat anyway, because people do anyway. They do not care, right? They can even keep fighting with the horrendous wounds. We know it happens on a regular base. But I mean, if they wound your hand and you have to fight with that, you're consistently crippled. And for not talking about head wounds, and the lack also of fit armor, as we've seen, speaks perhaps for a less mounted exposure. So yes, probably this means that there was a separation between the tactical roles already happening, and the technicality of knightly combat becoming ever more demanding, expansive, detached, separated from the rest of fighters. And this is in fact a moment also of considerable tactical development and of, in fact, maturity of knightly warfare, in a sense, that would reach its apex by the 13th century, but already in the 12th fundamentally reached its consistency as in the most iconic way. There is this process of specialization, and can be observed from other aspects. Consider the non-knightly status, and the fact that it would be sergeants that would be equipped, however, identically to knights, is due to the fact that many knights would sometimes even just delegate others to fight in their stead, right? They didn't want to. There is, by the 12th century, this gradual detachment. Before, knights, as we've seen, were essentially local lords who, like mobsters, would terrorize the surroundings with their bands of thugs, and creating their own scenery in a sense. At this point, there is some monarchic order that says at least the bigger guys, the high nobility has to organize kind of their own private armies. There is all an articulation of these organizations, and many knights, but people that were already framed under this baronial rule, etc., would say, okay, but do I really have to fight? If I have enough money, which is, Europe is starting to grow consistently at this time, even economically speaking, why can't I pay for somebody else fighting in my stead? So that also makes a difference in terms of status that is considered even on the field, right? At this point, the feudal elite was also pretty fanatic about its own prerogatives, and a non-knightly status person was definitely someone different. But there is a nice example from a French army maintained on the Norman border in 1203, consisting meaningfully of, I say, 257 knights, 267 mounted sergeants, 80 mounted crossbowmen, 133 infantry crossbowmen, and about 2,000 infantry sergeants. All these were royal troops, so they were paid by the King of France as evenly part of the levy, because there were also other 300 unspecified additional mercenaries. They were probably paid in similar ways, because at that time also the French king was trying to differentiate at that time, but the proportions here are meaningful. I mean, basically the mounted sergeants are the same number of knights, right? Just 10 more. 257, 267. And then we have 80 mounted crossbowmen. That also tells you, something about those tactics. 133 infantry crossbowmen and this 2,000 infantry surgeons. So these were hardly 2,000 kind of knights equivalents. They were let's say average infantry, probably not of the poorest order. It was probably medium infantry, or with even some kind of elite elements in it, plus other 200 mercenaries. So here you see proportionally the heavy of the weight of surgeons. They constitute basically the whole army, right? And half of the at least the shock cavalry, apparently, because the other guys left are the crossbowmen, so those are not even meant to charge, ideally. And we are at the beginning of the 13th century. Little note, consider that in the Crusader states, as we've seen more than once speaking of the Turcopoles, we have, even in Frankish armies, these hybrid figures that could be surgeons, in fact, or squires, that were fundamentally identical to the Turkish sipai. Right? Sometimes they were literally the same people, because Christians hired Turks all the time, too. But we know, of course, of Frankish Europeans, right, that would fight, that would learn, obviously, to fight as horse archers, lightly armored, well armed, but also agile, still horseman style, next to the heavy or armored knight, right? And as we've seen in the Holy Land, it seems that equipment, on average, among the Frankish forces was lighter than Europe, right? It's a bit of a, on average, probably is true. We don't have cent for cent, because here we mostly lack quantitative data that we can scientifically analyze. Another interesting aspect that reveals the importance of surgeons in this picture is the fact that some of them would be, increasingly valued as part of the lordly, the seigneurial retinues, and this kind of semi-permanent bodyguards that they went around with. In fact, we spotted from the first heraldic developments, because sergeants, as well as household knights, carried their lord's device on either their shield or lance, pennon, and surcoat, right? There is the beautiful illustrations in Pietro da Eboli's late 12th century Carmen de Rebus Siculis that speaks fundamentally of the Hohenstaufen's armies out there, and shows quite often. I've inserted lots of the pictures here in the video. Groups of horsemen that all have the same device on shields and helmets. That is interesting because, let's say, the concept of uniform didn't exist, but they had means of distinction that included this kind of painting. Very often, the same armor was colored, even very bright, like blue, red, green, not just black, by burning, but it could be also gold, silver in the elite. So medieval armies were way more colorful than we usually think, even at an early date like this. But here we see specifically, recurring patterns, homogeneous patterns on many of these knights groups in the manuscript, with, I don't know, the same symbol on the painted on the helmet or on the shield. So the surcoats themselves that start appearing this time might also have been uniform in color of the retinue. We know of even an English outlaw in 1218 who bought 100 marks worth of cloth for his band, quote, as if he had been a baron or an earl, right? And this is at least often quoted evidence for such practice at the time. Probably this started on a large scale, starting from the late 12th century, where that kind of professionalization and investment even in this kind of, and also because of the tactical complexity of the battlefields, would bring the need to distinguish specific units on the field, right? Sometimes it could be just like a normal going around, like maybe 40 knights, but it's still meaningful, right? Because it was a way in the mass of these battles, the relatively few pitched battles that were like a big tournament, right? To recognize each other, to stick close to each other, and to maintain cohesion. I mean, and in this back and forth of charges, counter charges, and so on, that happened. Also, more disorderly sometimes than when we think. We have seen it in many instances when making battle videos. But that speaks also for a greater collective training that would ideally have to make these guys remaining fact information, and therefore to be easily identifiable on the field, to command them, to reconnect even if you got lost with them, and so on, aside from flags that naturally remain the most important elements on the field. So for now we say this much about surgeons. We will come back on the topic at some point because there is something else to add here and there. But the crucial aspect here is the existence of a knightly complement that is not properly the elite one, that however makes sometimes the backbone of the armies. It could be also not just made up of cavalrymen, but still, given that that was the most important arm on the field, and looking at its relative numbers, I mean, that made a difference on the battlefield, at the point of being also sometimes indistinguishable from knights in terms of performance, right? I would conclude just by saying that anytime you hear somebody saying, well, but these guys perhaps were kind of less than knights, or there were certain areas in Europe where maybe knights were say different from others in terms of performance, etc. We have no ways of saying that, right? The only way you have to make a point like that, which is very difficult by these times, especially because of the level of documentation, is that you pick, I don't know, 20 battles, and you spot that, I mean, if there is a sharp difference between certain groups, that reason. So that's the problem, actually. You can't start making a statistic and therefore systematic, structural remark about that. But even if you look at the simple technicality of warfare at the time, I mean, if these guys are kept in the same way, yes, of course, they had different capacities. There were places that were probably more, that were they had fought more than others. That were more fit in a sense. But to try to distinguish how eventually, the performance, it doesn't make sense, because these guys could be found everywhere. They traveled, they fought in a way we can't even properly track. And it was also mixed and homogeneous. And at this time, European warfare is becoming dramatically homogeneous. So there is really no great difference of sort. And even the one you could ideally spot is very difficult on the base of the sources to actually make a point, a structural point. So even for the knights, sergeants segmentation, let's say, of heavy cavalry, it's very difficult to make a point like that. Right, unless you see it, and here iconography or let's say the level of equipment that we're reading in the rule of the order or the temple is more useful in my opinion, because that is still a meaningful difference made on the battlefield. I mean, as a prescription at least, and even the specific type, not just the fact that they were less armored, but how they were less armored. I mean, what they were required to have, not to have, given the parts of the body exposed, tells, in my opinion, the story of a tactical diversification. That is valid, however, only for those who had the specifics. There were others, as we've seen, that didn't. So they were actually identical to knights. Alright, for now we stop here, and I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.